The greatest boxer of all time is one of the most divisive topics in the sport. There are so many different factors that you have to take into account when comparing fighters, and there have just been so many fantastic boxers over the last century. But there is one name that is synonymous with the title of greatest of all time, and that's Sugar Ray Robinson. In the opinion of most experts and boxing legends, Robinson is the greatest fighter to ever step through the ropes. And after watching lots of boxing myself, I for one have to agree with that statement. And in this video, I'm going to attempt to explain to you why I believe Sugar Ray Robinson is the greatest boxer of all time. Firstly, it's important to understand the era in which Robinson boxed in compared to the modern era. Nowadays, fighters make a lot more money than they used to, and they fight a lot less often than when Robinson was around. The best boxers in the world today will fight somewhere between 2 to 4 times a year, whereas Robinson sometimes fought 20 times a year. And this was frequently against the very top opposition available. And a big comparison I've seen from modern boxing fans is the fact that Robinson didn't beat as many world champions as the great champions of today, like Mayweather and Pacquiao. But once again, this is due to the differences in eras. Back in Robinson's day, there was only one champion per weight division, and there were only 8 weight divisions in the sport. In boxing today, there are 18 weight divisions and almost 4 world champions per division. And by stating this, I don't mean to take any credit away from Mayweather and Pacquiao, who achieved amazing achievements and have legendary resumes. But I simply feel like this comparison isn't a fair one, as there were much less title holders for Robinson to beat during his time. But this doesn't mean he wasn't fighting top level operators. He beat dozens of Hall of Famers and some of the greatest fighters of all time. And the more impressive thing is, he beat most of them multiple times. He had an incredible amateur record of 85 wins, no losses and 69 knockouts, and even held a win against the great Willie Pep. On the topic of Robinson's resume, let's take it back to the very beginning. In his first 40 fights, he beat Hall of Famers such as Sammy Angot twice, Fritzy Zivic twice, and Jake LaMotta, before losing to LaMotta in his 41st fight. But the response to this defeat would be incredible, and Robinson would go unbeaten in his next 91 fights, racking his record up to an incredible 128 wins to 1 loss and just 2 draws. Robinson's dominance and level of activity during his time is phenomenal. He fought 91 times in 8 years, beating Jake LaMotta 4 times, the legendary Henry Armstrong, Sammy Angot, Artie Levine, Kid Gavilan twice, and Bobo Olsen, all Hall of Famers. There's no denying that Robinson was at his absolute peak at welterweight, but the tragedy of this is that there's no footage that exists of him fighting at welterweight, meaning all of the footage available is basically Robinson past his prime. But from the footage that exists of Robinson, we can see that he was one of the most complete fighters in boxing history and had an incredibly fluid style. Ray could do everything in the ring. He had beautiful footwork, could throw combinations like no one else, and had knockout power. But not only was he a beautiful boxer, but he was both incredibly tough, durable, and had a great chin. He fought some of the toughest fighters of his era in brutal fights and could mix it up close with the best of them. After dominating at welterweight and winning the middleweight titles, his legendary unbeaten streak would come to an end when he was out-hustled by the British underdog Randolph Turpin. Turpin would clearly beat the much favoured Robinson, both outpointing and outfighting him throughout the duration of the fight. But it wouldn't take long for Robinson to get his revenge and reclaim the title a few months later by a knockout. He'd then defend his title against 2 Hall of Famers in Rocky Graziano and Bobo Olsen before attempting to move up to light heavyweight to beat the champion Joey Maxim. Robinson was clearly outboxing the much bigger champion and was en route to a wide points decision. But the temperature was so hot that night that even the referee had to be replaced. In rounds 14, Robinson suffered from heat exhaustion and was forced to be stopped in the corner. And following this defeat, he'd moved back down to middleweight and would be involved in some rivalries against some of the toughest middleweights of all time, in Carmen Basilio, Gene Fullmer and Paul Pender. During this stint, Robinson was in his mid to late 30s and would win and lose against these opponents in some really grueling fights. But you can still see hints of a prime Sugar Ray Robinson, most notably when he scored one of the greatest knockouts of all time with a perfect left hook against a very durable Fullmer. All in all, Robinson would win the welterweight title and the middleweight titles 5 times. He would have over 32 fights against Hall of Famers and some of the greatest fighters of all time, ranging from welterweight to light heavyweight, winning most of them and taking the majority of the losses to the back end of his career. Like most boxing legends, Robinson would box for way too long and take a lot of losses in his 40s. And after a 25-year career, he would eventually retire with a record of 174 wins with 109 knockouts to 19 losses and 6 draws. He was awarded the Fighter of the Decade award in both the 1940s and the 1950s. He was one of the most well-rounded boxers in history, with wins against almost every significant fighter of his time. He was the most dominant fighter in history in his prime, and even past his prime was always mixing it with the best and bouncing back from defeats. He would always challenge himself against the best opponents available, showed championship heart throughout his entire career, and was involved in many of the biggest fights in boxing history. Robinson's incredible boxing style was years ahead of its time and would inspire some of the greatest fighters that followed him. If he was knocked down, he'd always get up and was rarely stopped in a 25-year career. And on the rare occasions that he was defeated in his prime, he would always avenge that defeat in a rematch. With over 200 professional fights, lots of them being at the top level, and over 100 career knockouts, he was the complete package. And that is why Robinson, in my opinion, is the greatest fighter of all time.